Hello everyone and welcome. Now, when managing and organizing an interpretation project, there are some fundamental aspects that can be really useful to keep in mind. Very often you will also be the person project managing or running an interpretation project, the overall project. I think one of the reasons for this is that very often when you work in interpretation, you become the person with a lot of contacts. Usually you will be the first contact for external people like designers, digital designers, reenactors, actors, photographers, artists, whoever you are working with. Very often the interpretation person is the first contact or the first to establish contact. And therefore project managing and actual scheduling and coordinating work tasks and the overall project is very often something that is also part of your interpretation tasks. Just be careful that that you don't overdo this and all of a sudden you are doing project management instead of interpretation, but that can happen sometimes. Project management, I find, is sadly a skill and a practice that is overlooked a lot at especially museums. There are some incredibly skillful well-educated project managers out there, and they're not often hired by museums, sadly. Very often project management is something that's incorporated into other aspects of a museum work, like into interpretation or into curatorial management or whatever it is. But there are some fundamental things if you ever do project manage an interpretation project or indeed any other museum project. There are some fundamental aspects that can be really good to keep an eye on. Let's have a look at the basic resources required for any kind of project, long-term or short-term. Usually when we refer to resources, we talk about three main things really. First of all, the money, the costs. Usually your budget, of course, and usually this will be things associated with what you have to pay to get this project up and running. So it will be costs mainly. However, it can also be income sometimes. Sometimes you might take an extra fee or charge for a special exhibition or for certain activities in a, let's say, a season activity or interpretation activity, a live interpretation or reenactment activity, or something that people have to pay extra for, perhaps because some resources are associated with using it. It can be anything from having drawing activities and people have to pay for paper and so on, or playing with bow and arrow or whatever, and you need people to stand there and to help people with a certain activity. Whatever it is, there can be an income associated as well if you have some extra costs around certain activities. So just bear in mind both your costs but also income around this. Time, planning and execution. Now, often you will find that the planning of a project takes a lot longer than the actual execution. Sometimes you have maybe a week of activities to set up, and the planning will be months in advance. It can also be you have a long-term exhibition project for an exhibition that might run, let's say, 6 months, and the planning and the preparation for that will be a year at least in advance of that. So make sure you have time for the various things you need to plan and for the execution of your project. And of course, manpower, the people needed, but also here, not just the number of hands and heads needed, but also the relevant people. Do you have the relevant resources in-house, your colleagues, or do you need to go to external people and perhaps buy resources in, buy services in, or people who can help you do specific things, perhaps design or perhaps digital content or whatever it might be. So how many people are needed, but also who are the relevant people you need for this specific project. Now, if we go into a little bit further detail around these, there are some things that's really good to have clarity on. First of all, the scale of your project. How big is this in terms of the physical requirements? Is it an exhibition space? Is it perhaps a historical site that you need to use? how can you use it if it's a historical building, for example? What are some of the restrictions you might have to be aware of when certain activities have to take place? So have an idea about the scale of your project. This go hand in hand with your time plan. Now, everything that needs work on around your project, whether it be the first initial brainstorms, your planning, collaborations with external people, the creation, installation, maybe you need to rehearse for a live interpretation event, practice, evaluation along the way, set up, everything. If it's possible, make sure you have enough time, especially when working with external partners or contractors, because usually they will come with their own time plan as well that you have to fit into your overall project time plan. So for example, designers will have an idea about how long it takes for them to do the various bits around the design, and you need to be able to fit their time plan into your overall time plan as well. Now, stakeholder management is an interesting one, because sometimes you don't really have specific stakeholders on a project, but you can also have quite a lot on certain projects, and some very keen ones. They can be internal, they can be external, it can be partners you work with, they can also be volunteers helping you with the project, and of course trustees and board members. Get an idea about their level of engagement and their commitment to the project. Some are very keen and want regular updates and so on, and others are perhaps less interested, but perhaps they sit with some very important decision making to do around the project, so it will be important to keep them updated and keep them in the loop on what's going on. So just have a very quick brainstorm around your stakeholders, who they are, how engaged they are, what you need to do to keep them updated. Now, budget we already talked a little bit about, but make sure that you have specified some of the specific or unusual costs, because there will always be something that's a little bit unusual from the last budget you did. Maybe this is a project that requires that you buy new things. Perhaps you need to buy costumes or new display cases, or perhaps you need some large printed guides or large panels, or whatever you need. Whatever it is you need. It can also be digital costs. Make sure you have a contingency set aside, so there will be something that will cost more than what you have already planned, and make sure that you have that in your budget if at all possible around this. Also try and get some clarity around the different responsibilities and the job roles, who is doing what, because it might not always be clear who's in charge of which part of a project. And people will come in and out of a project along the way. If you have a very long project, maybe an exhibition project that runs for 1, 2, 3 years, people will have various roles along the line. So you might have designers on board for, let's say, a year out of 3. You might have digital software developers or something on board for 6 months. You might have researchers or curatorial people on board, curators on board, maybe external curators as well for the beginning of the project, but not really the later part of the project. So have an idea about who is doing what, who is responsible for what, but also when do the different people come in and out of the project. Finally, risk management is always useful, although it sounds really boring, I realize that, but try and identify potential risks where you can. It can be anything from delays, extra costs, it can be absence, it can also be replacements. There might be people who leave the project in the middle of it, maybe because their contract runs out, or they simply find a new job. Some people might retire. There will be people coming in and out all the time. It can also be things like repair and maintenance, especially if you are dealing with perhaps a physical piece of interpretation like an exhibition, or some digital, online, or indeed digital interpretation. It might also be repair around live interpretation. I think we all know repair around, for example, costumes or props for live interpretation or live reenactment. So try and have an idea about what is required in terms of some of the risks, some of the things that could either go wrong or delay things, or things that need repair and maintenance, and keeping an eye on along the way. That's always a useful little exercise to do. Now, I would like to ask you, what are some of the things that you have come across when managing an interpretation or heritage or museum project? What are some of the most important aspects of that work to keep in mind as you work through the different phases of any kind of interpretation project? Please share your thoughts on this, and also remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and add your comments.